Hail Hail and welcome to part 4 of the Celtic History podcast series, which charts the history of Celtic Football Club from 1887 to the current day. In part 3 of the series, titled Improvisation and Inspiration, Chris was joined by the green and white writer Paul Larkin, and they covered the period from 1920 to 1930. They continued to detail the struggle with Rangers as our Southside neighbours began to rise in power and how Willie Maley maintained a challenge to them. The sectarian divide intensifies around this time, and the fight for independence in Ireland continues. Closer to home, there is a rise of Red Clydeside and social unrest as the country enters a state of recession after the end of the First World War. We are introduced to more tales on stars like Jimmy McStay, Tommy McNally and Patsy Gallagher, which leads on to an examination of a legend that was Jimmy McGrory. We also hear for the first time about the phenomenon that was John Thomson. And the boys then explore the famous Patsy Gallagher Scottish Cup final in 1925 and how his goal became one of the most celebrated in world football. We hear more about the development of Celtic Park as parts of the stadium and Celtic history are lost as a result of fire. There are more details of the hoops as well as the introduction of the away kit in the 1920s, mixed with more fan stories and confessions.
If there was ever an epitome on the field of the Celtic Football Club, it was probably Jimmy McGrory.
Many of the pictures from the first 40 years of the club were stored and displayed within the pavilion. When the building caught fire, it spread so quickly that nothing could be saved.
You had, Patsy Gallagher, who, fantastic Donegal man, a definite guy who could definitely be a good claim to be the greatest player that Celtic ever had at Celtic Park. Patsy and Tommy McNally and Jimmy McGrory were all absolute Celtic through and through.
The hoops were worn throughout this decade, along with the ever-present white shorts.
It was during this decade that a lot of the sectarian strife started in Glasgow.
And Celtic supporters and people with kind of Irish origin and stuff were treated pretty shoddily.
As the 1920s stuttered to a disappointing conclusion, perhaps one man more than any gave the Celts hope for the future.
And then, of course, in 1925 we had the famous Patsy Gallagher Cup final. That was the point where Patsy somersaulted into the net.
Every Celtic supporter you talk to, every single one, has a story to tell.
Why are you a Celtic fan?
I became a Celtic fan May 1967 at 7 years of age.
It was a struggle between the virtues, the improvisation and inspiration of Celtic and the organisation and method of Rangers. And I think that sums up perfectly the difference between Celtic and Rangers.
Now we will join Chris McGuigan for part 4 of a 10-part series where he will cover the period of 1930 to 1940 with his guest from the Celtic Wiki, Mr. Tom Minogue.
The Empire Exhibition came to Glasgow on the Clyde, as hardly tried the Sunderland, and hearts were swept aside. And Everton, their hearts were broke, as divers Crum and all sang Celtic first and Celtic last, and Celtic over all.
Chapter 4. If the 1920s had been the battleground in a fight for supremacy in Scottish football, then it was all too evident by the start of the next decade that there had emerged only one winner. At the climax of season 1929-30, Rangers had claimed their 4th successive championship and a second league and Scottish Cup double in 3 seasons. In stark contrast, Celtic had endured their 3rd straight campaign without claiming a major honour. In the title race, the Hoops had finished a distant 4th, some 11 points behind the champions. It was hard for supporters of the famous Parkhead team to admit. A club which had dominated the opening decades of the century in such a thrilling fashion had now meekly surrendered their crown. Rangers, under the strict guidance of Bill Struth, had developed into a ruthless and relentless football force. Their strength and fitness was unrivalled. On and off the pitch, the club instilled among its players and followers a deep-rooted sense of their own supremacy. They may have lacked the excitement and attacking alacrity of the great Celtic sides of the past, but at Ibrox, success was essential, and style were relevant. This determined professionalism of Rangers was not mirrored at Celtic Park. The Hoops' emergence as a football giant had been in no small part to the fierce ambition and foresight of the club's early stewards. How times had changed. The departure of men like Tommy McInally and Adam McLean, coupled with a shameful attempt to sell Jimmy McGrory, highlighted the lack of aspiration that typified the parquet boardroom of the 1920s. The boys, in a bid to save money, had even abandoned running their reserve team. The influence of a once inspirational Willie Maley was waning, the aging manager increasingly suffering from bouts of ill health. But despite it all, the Celtic faithful retained hope. At the start of this new decade, there was still talent at Parkhead, and in the great McGrory, the boys still possessed the greatest goal scorer in the game. With McGrory leading the attack and young Scotland international John Thomson guarding the goal, anything was possible. But no one could have predicted the triumphs and tragedies that was to follow. In season 1930-31, Celtic's league form was much improved, but they would trail Rangers once more, finishing runner-up, 2 points behind Struth's men. The Hoops' good form was also evident in the Scottish Cup, as they hit 15 goals in an emphatic march to Hampden. On Saturday, April the 11th, 1931, Celtic and an impressive Motherwell side went head-to-head in the final. As 12 times winners, the boys certainly had cup tradition on their side. But despite making their cup final debut, it was the Steelmen, regarded as the best footballing side in Scotland, who were most people's favourites. The Lanarkshire team settled quickly on a bumpy and fast surface, and within 6 minutes had taken the lead. Boosted by this early opener, Motherwell continued to press forward, their slick passing game frequently leaving the Celtic defence in disarray. It was no surprise when well deservedly doubled their lead on 20 minutes. Celtic now had no option but to attack. They dominated possession, appeared to lack the creativity to break down a stubborn defence. In contrast, Motherwell were content to play a containing game, hitting their opponents with swift and incisive counter-attacks. But just as the match was entering its final stages, Celtic pressure at last caused some creaking of the well rearguard. The assured resistance of earlier was now replaced by desperate long punts out of play. There was just 7 minutes left when Celtic won a free kick on the edge of the area. With everyone expecting a shot on goal, Charlie Napier cleverly lobbed the ball over a wall, where the onrushing McGrory stretched out his right leg and guided the ball into the net. Brushing off the congratulations of his teammates, McGrory collected the ball from the goal. As he raced back to his centre circle, the inspirational forward pointed up to the clock on the terracing. There was still time, there was still hope. Roared on by rejuvenated support, Celtic swamped the Motherwell defence, now stricken by panic. With seconds remaining, a Johnny Thompson kick-out found Bertie Thompson out on the right wing. Bertie beat 2 men and sent a swirling high ball into the goal mouth. With the ever-alert McGrory lurking, Motherwell centre-half Alan Craig leapt high to clear, but the ball glanced off his forehead, past the stranded keeper, and into the net. Celtic had equalised. The boys were ecstatic, Craig left in tears. The late comeback had floored Motherwell, and it was no surprise when Celtic deservedly won an entertaining replay, 4-2. The Scottish Cup would join the boys as Celtic embarked on their first tour of North America that summer. The sight of the famous hoops and the old trophy provoked joyous scenes among the thousands of exiled supporters who flocked to see their never-forgotten heroes. But while that summer tour sparked scenes of wild jubilation, events back in Scotland on September the 5th would leave the whole nation numb with grief. It was on that date Celtic travelled to Ibrox for a league clash with Rangers. A crowd of 80,000 witnessed a goalless first half. 5 minutes after the restart, the hosts launched an attack on their opponent's goal, ball was played into the area, where Johnny Thomson raced from his line to bravely dive at the feet of the on-rushing Sam English. And thwarting his opponent, John's head connected with the knee of the Rangers forward. As the ball rolled out of play, the young keeper lay still on the field. The concerned English and John's Celtic teammates quickly called for help. Initially, the Rangers support heckled and booed the Celtic keeper. For those on the pitch, it was clear the situation was serious. As the home support continued with their catcalls, Rangers captain David Micklejohn went over to the crowd and urged them to be quiet. A hush fell over the stadium. His head wrapped in bandages, Johnny Thomson was carried from the silent park on a stretcher and taken to Glasgow's Victoria Hospital. It was there he would die later that evening. The funeral of Johnny Thomson took place on Wednesday, September the 9th. A short service in the garden of the Thomson home was followed by a burial at Bow Hill Cemetery. An estimated 40,000 people lined the road between the Thomson home and his graveside. They climbed walls and sat high upon rooftops as John's teammates carried his coffin through the crowded streets. Nothing would deny the heartbroken Celtic support the chance to bid farewell to their beloved John. 2 special trains had left Glasgow for Carden Den that morning, while hundreds had walked from Glasgow to Fife, sleeping in fields just to be there on the day of the funeral. Johnny Thomson had been an incredible and precocious talent. Handsome yet humble, he was a goalkeeper of great athleticism and sublime grace. A hero for both club and country. His loss at just 22 years of age cast a shadow across a nation. Yet all too soon there would be further loss and heartbreak for his teammates and friends. Later that very same month, popular inside forward Peter Scarff took ill during a game. Having struggled for breath during the opening period, Peter failed to come out from the second half. He would be diagnosed with tuberculosis. After 2 years of treatment, Peter would die at the age of 25. It is little surprise that such matters would impact on events on the pitch. Celtic's form dipped dramatically, and they would end season 1931-32 trophyless, as Motherwell finally ended Rangers' run of league triumphs. Poor league form the following campaign would, however, be compensated for in the Cup, when McGrory grabbed the only goal of a Dara final, as the boys delivered more hammed in agony for Motherwell.
We sang Celtic first and Celtic last and Celtic overall.
Okay, welcome to Chapter 4 of the Celtic History Podcast, where we're going to cover 1930 to 1940, and I'm absolutely delighted to say I have on the phone Tom Minogue from the Celtic Wiki. How are you, Tom?
I'm fine, Chris. How are you?
Oh, I'm absolutely loving life, Tom.
Good.
I'm loving this, so I am.
Good.
Especially when we come to a decade, Tom, where we've got conspiracy theories again, we've got one-off trophies, we've got tragedy, and we've got ecstasy. It's absolutely super, isn't it?
We've got everything in this decade, that's for sure.
The beauty about these podcasts is, we can actually talk about the events that went on during these decades, rather than just tell the history. We'll tell the history as well, but actually to discuss some of the burning issues at the time. And right from the offset in 1931, and we'll ring the conspiracy bell right away this week, and we'll talk about a refereeing controversy that there was about a protest about the standard of refereeing by Celtic.
Yes, indeed, Chris. This was a game in the season 1930 to 31. It was a Glasgow Cup final, and although Celtic won that game, the refereeing was so bad that Celtic lodged a protest. And this was unusual, but it was more unusual because not only did they lodge a protest, as these things usually would be, in confidence with the SFA, but in this instance, they went public. They published the letter. They went to the press and said, here's our letter of complaint. And it's not the first letter of complaint. We've won the game, but the referees allowed Charlie Napier, and fans' favourite Bertie Thomson and Johnny Thomson to be kicked black and blue. There was a near riot in that game following a disallowed goal by the referee. The referee was a guy called John Thomson of Burnbank, Hamilton. And Celtic allowed this letter to be published, and it was scathing, and it was published in the Herald, the Glasgow Herald, and it named the Rangers player they were complaining about, and as I say, it also named the Celtic players who'd been the victims of this lack of protection from the referee. So it was a real biggie, Chris, and it was in the strongest possible terms.
And Tom, was this something that was building up, or was this just a one-off because of that game?
No, it wasn't, and the letter made that clear, that this was not something that had just been building up. They said that they had been making similar complaints recently and frequently. So it was a biggie.
And when you think about the style of the play at that time, I mean, we've talked about it in some of the earlier podcasts about the rough treatment that goalkeepers got, and we'll obviously come on to that in a few minutes. But in a time when the game was obviously a lot rougher than what it is today, that was quite a stand it took.
That was a very strong stand they took. And the referees, of course, they didn't take kindly to one of their own, this Jai Thomson of Burnbank, being criticised publicly in this manner, and they demanded an apology. Now, there's no record that I can find of whether an apology was given, and the matter just seems to dry up in the press there. But considering what happened subsequently in 1931 with John Thomson, this is dynamite. And the referee in question then didn't referee another Celtic game for the next 36 games, and he'd been a regular referee at Celtic games, and he didn't referee again until the following season. So it was a big issue. And as I say, published in the Herald. Can you imagine that now?
I can only dream of them doing that now.
Yes. This is what I say, Chris. The fans sometimes say, or the press rather sometimes say, that, the clubs don't complain about referees. They've always been satisfied in the past. And here, right at the beginning of the 30s, you've got Celtic saying in the strongest possible terms, after a game they've won, that we ain't getting protection from the referees, and this isn't the first complaint.
And that falls in nicely with what we've been talking about so far in the first 40 years of the history, where the style of Celtic was get the ball down, pass it, attack, and then particularly in the last decade when I talked to Paul Larkin about the development of the style of Rangers, where it was organised, tough, brutal at times. This was probably the culmination of this, and here we have Celtic actually getting to the stage where they had to complain to the authorities about the treatment they were getting.
Yes, indeed. So yes, it was a big event, and seems to have been lost. I didn't know about it until I did this era for the Wiki, and I couldn't believe it when I saw the Herald article. And as I say, it named the three suffering parties in the Celtic team. It was Charlie Napier on one wing, Bertie Thomson on the other, and John Thomson in goal. And they named the Rangers player, although that wasn't published in the Herald article. But it said that they had the copy of the letter which named the Rangers culprit. So right at the start of this era, we're at odds with the referees. And when you look at that and the previous complaints, it makes you wonder if Celtic could have went on their tour as League and Scottish Cup winners, because I looked back then after I saw this letter, and there were some bizarre events previous to that Celtic might have complained. And one of them was a game against Queen's Park at Hampden where Celtic were 3-2 up. And the referee blew for time. Players trooped off, and the linesman spoke to the referee as he's going off and called the players back onto the pitch and said there was another 2 minutes to be played. During which time the referee, Mr. Dougray, awarded Queen's Park a penalty, and James V. McAlpine duly scored and levelled the scores. Well, You know, you could imagine that would be one of the instances that Celtic have complained about. So complaining about referees didn't start with Hugh Dallas or any of the ones that went before him. So this was timekeeping at its most creative, you could say. But that happened then. So Celtic may have went to the USA and Canada as league and cup winners, but they didn't. They got beat by 2 points. Rangers won the league, but the refereeing decisions didn't start with Hugh Dallas or Bobby Davison or Tiny Wharton. They were going back right to then.
So there you go, the conspiracy theories were
Right
alive
away,
and
yeah.
well.
With the stadium upgrades complete, the next few decades saw little change at Celtic Park. However, Celtic themselves were on the move more than ever before. Celtic left Scotland in 1931 and crossed the Atlantic Ocean for the first time, taking the team to the USA and Canada, where expatriates of both Ireland and Scotland could see how the two countries had united to form something wonderful. The team were even able to take the Scottish Cup across the ocean to prove just how successful they had been. The 5-day sail was not a journey taken lightly, although on the way back to Glasgow, Jimmy McGrory took advantage of the time to stop off in Ireland to get married. However, while fortunes originally favoured the team, they did not favour the masses. The depression of the early 1930s saw attendances dip, although that may have coincided with an unaccustomed dip in the team's fortunes. Fortunately, by the end of the decade, both team fortunes and attendances were soaring once more. 149,415 fans packed into Hampden Park to watch Scotland take on England in 1937. That very same year, Celtic played Aberdeen in the Scottish Cup final, where 146,433 spectators watched Celtic win 2-1. Both European records still stand today for international and club matches. Celtic Park's record attendance was also set in the New Year derby of 1938, where 83,000 saw Rangers defeated 3-0. Some reports also suggest that attendance was as high as 92,000. 1937 also saw Celtic play an exhibition match against the Lennox Hospital 11 to mark the opening of a football pitch in the hospital's grounds in February of that year. Although not the first team, it did feature the likes of Matt Lynch and Johnny Divers. Little did they know that 70 years later, Celtic would be returning to those same grounds on a more permanent basis. Along the Gallagate from Celtic Park, Barrowland opened in 1934. Although destroyed by fire in 1958 and rebuilt in 1960, Barrowland was the leading dance hall in Scotland practically from its opening. It also doubled as an indoor marketplace at weekends, even spilling out into the streets surrounding the building. That market remains a famous part of Glasgow's East End, affectionately known as the Barras. 1938 saw the Empire Exhibition come to Glasgow. Centred around Bellahouston Park, it celebrated the British Empire on the 50th anniversary of another exhibition in Glasgow's Kelvin Grove area. Part of the celebrations included a football tournament consisting of 8 teams from north and south of the border. Perhaps fittingly, it was the teams celebrating their own 50th anniversary that came away with the prize, a trophy modelled on the Tate Tower, which was a centrepiece of the exhibition in Bellahouston Park. Standing at 300 feet tall and situated on top of a hill in the park, the gleaming tower with its 3 separate observation decks could be seen from 100 miles away. Sadly, Thomas S. Tate's tower remained a feature of Glasgow's skyline for no more than a year. As the Second World War loomed large, the orders were given to demolish the tower in July 1939. All that remains of the exhibition in 21st century Glasgow is the Palace of Art, although the Palace of Engineering was dismantled and moved to Prestwick Airport to increase factory floor space during the war. That war would halt football and so many other aspects of life for much of the next decade. Fortunately, however, the model of the tower that was football's prize can still be found in the boardroom of the team that won it.
So we did then actually head off on a US tour, a North American tour of Canada and the USA, and it was quite an eventful trip.
Very, yeah. They arrived a day late. The Mayor of New York was waiting for them to give them a reception. A guy called Jimmy Walker, a very colourful character, and they were a day late getting there. But they eventually got the reception, and they had quite a stormy time of it in the States. It wasn't just all sweetness and light. They played 13 games and all. They won 9, lost 3 and drew 1. But there was quite a lot of rough play, and some of the Celtic players were criticised. Charlie Napier was known in the press as a real shin buster, they called him, and you can't imagine it because the impression you get of Napier was as a sort of skillful ball player. But yeah, it was colourful times, and I tried to put myself in the position of some of these young guys in America, and it was prohibition at the time, so I would imagine people who liked to drink, like Bertie Thompson was known to like a drink, the great McGonagall, maybe Peter Scarff and Charlie Napier and these guys, I would reckon they would head for the speakeasies in New York, and I reckon there was about anywhere between 30 and 100,000 speakeasies in New York. And it was the time of Al Capone was trying to muscle in, Dutch Schultz run the beer business, Legs Diamond was running bootleg liquor into New York. So these were exciting times, and I can just imagine that team, or some of them anyway, having a rare old time in New York.
It must have been fantastic too to go and visit America at that time. As you say, Al Capone in 1931 was just imprisoned for tax evasion and stuff.
Yeah.
So the whole gangster thing was in full swing. It must be
It was in full swing. There was an advert in one of the papers where a Celtic match was covered, and it was an advert for the paper. They were having a campaign to stop gangsterism, and Prohibition had been running for about 12 years, and these gangsters had become really, really powerful, and they owned politicians, judges, and it was just about this time that the people had had enough. They were having huge mass meetings against gangsterism. Kids were getting killed in the crossfire. So yeah, it was right at the height of that Celtic were playing. So it's a great time, but it was a hard time in America as well because we're 18 months into the Great Depression. People are suffering badly, jobs are lost, and it's real hardship. In fact, the mayor of Philadelphia, when Celtic went there, there's a famous picture of the mayor of Philadelphia, a guy called Harry A. Mackey, with Jimmy McStay in the Scottish Cup. And just prior to Celtic arriving, a few months earlier, Mayor Mackey had warned that there were 250,000 people in Philadelphia who were starving, and they might have to get the National Guard out, the troopers out, because he predicted there was going to be a breakdown in law and order because of this 250,000 starving. And of course, we tend to think of America as the land of plenty, but at that time, it was a hard place to be. It was the hungry 30s was right enough.
Now, one of the things that jumps off the page at you when you look at the American tour of 1931 is the name of the teams that they played that were from America. Now, of course, you had some look like amateur teams and the Bricklayers and Fall River, but there's a couple of big names jumps off the page at you. The New York Yankees.
Yes.
Who actually beat Celtic 4-3 at Fenway Park in Boston.
That's correct.
There was the New York Giants.
Yep.
Ulster United.
Yes.
Surely soccer in America at that stage was a bit of a non-event, was it?
Well, it was an experimental thing. I think the tour was experimental. willy-nilly it wasn't something that was just plucked out of the hat and they decided to go. Willy-nilly had went over with Tom Colgan 10 years prior to the tour, and they'd sounded out the interest, obviously, and decided that, there was plenty of interest there for them to go. But I suppose they couldn't have foreseen the Great Depressions. But it had been a long time in the planning, and people were keen. The US Football Association had tried to sponsor Celtic to go, but in the event, it was a guy called Sam Mark, who was the owner of the New York Yankees. He sponsored the tour for Celtic to come, so he was the guy who organised it.
And the other little tidbit that is very interesting for the Celtic historians out there listening to this is that we played a team called the Michigan All-Stars on the 25th of June, and it was the first time that Celtic ever played under floodlights.
That's correct, yeah.
So there was a few firsts there as well.
Oh, there was a few firsts, and I think Celtic underestimated what they were going to. That's the impression I get. Of course, I'm only getting impressions as I look at it, but I get the impression they thought they would be going out there and playing against really nobodies. But they were going out there and they were playing good footballers. They were playing against people who had been at the World Cup with the USA, from all over Europe, who had come to the melting pot. Teams like Hakwa, the Jewish team made up mostly of Austrian, Hungarian Jews, and a lot of ex-Scottish and English players were out there who were no mugs. So there was a lot of good seasoned pros they were up against. So they didn't get it all their own way, and I think that maybe surprised them a bit.
Well, when you look at the results, they lost a few games. There was a couple of strolls in the park, of course there was, but they lost against the Yankees, and they lost against Pawtucket Rangers, and they lost against Fall River.
It would be the Rangers, wouldn't it?
It would have to be the Rangers, and it would have to be the Yankees as well. But just to balance things up, just to let people know, they did play the Yankees twice and beat them the second time.
They got their revenge, they did indeed.
Celtic won on aggregate.
Yes, that's right. And I think the real grudge game, the one that caused the most controversy, was the Hakwa game, where two players from each side were sent off. It was a real dirty game, apparently. So this wasn't friendlies as you would know them. The other teams had a point to prove as well. And of course, back to what we started with in this talk about American tour, was it was the hungry 30s. These people they were playing against, these guys were playing for their livelihood, and they couldn't be seen to be duds, so they were giving it their best shot.
And that actually came to fruition after the tragedy of John Thomson, because the goalkeeper that came in after John Thomson was Joe Kennaway, who was a Canadian.
From Fall River.
That's right.
Who'd played against him at Fall River, yeah. And it had been said on the tour, if you read the tour books by McGrory and these people, that Joe Kennaway was the best player they'd played against. And of course Celtic had failed to score against them. But they only brought one player back with them, Celtic, and it was a guy called Jimmy Maguire. And he went back, Mealy signed him and he went back with them. But he never did much at Celtic Park. But strangely enough went on to become the head of the US Football Association and a member of the FIFA committee that organised, I think it was the 1974 World Cup.
Oh, wow.
So Jimmy Maguire went on to be a big shot in the game. So, yeah, they also met a lot of ex-soccer players who had played in Scotland. So, yeah, a lot of interesting stuff there. And, as I say, Jimmy Maguire had done well. He went right to the top. But you look at some of the players that played, and you've got other people who came from Scotland. There was a guy from Clydebank, and he just disappeared off the face of the earth. So, yeah, some did well, some didn't do well.
The feds proclaim that law and order is prevailing in the long fight against organised crime. Testament to this is Al Scarface Capone, the infamous extortionist and murderer, who is currently sitting behind bars at Alcatraz, and has been so since 1931. Today's date, May the 23rd, 1934, will also go down in history. as the bittersweet end to Bonnie and Clyde's outlandish spree of bank robbery.
When we think back to the 30s, the one incident of the 30s that dwarfs everything else, of course, is the tragedy of John Thomson on the 5th of September 1931.
Yeah. That, and I did the whole decade for the Celtic Wiki, except, and I had entries in every game in that, and possibly 2 match reports for each game in that whole decade. And the one page I didn't have to touch was the John Thomson page, because it was so comprehensively covered. And it's a strange thing that, you know, he caught the imagination, he crossed the divide, all the divides in Scotland that was quite divided on religious grounds at that time. He caught everybody's imagination, and it got massive coverage in the press, and it was just such a sad event. But funnily enough, as I say, I didn't have to touch it, but I looked at the game following his death, when for the first time they ran out at Celtic Park after his death, and that was very poignant. But it was very simple, and the ceremony before it was just the Celtic team. I could actually read to you what they said. It said a small article the size of a big postage stamp, Chris, and it says an impressive tribute. It's headlined. Impressive tribute was paid to John Thomson at Celtic Park on Saturday. The flags were at half-mast, and all round the ground there was a subdued air. Celtic came out first, filing slowly from the pavilion, followed by Queen's Park. The 22 players forming an unbroken line as they walked to the field and they took up their positions. All wore black armlets. The crowd did not know how to welcome the players. There was a moment's hesitation, and then a half-hearted cheer rippled round the field. Players and spectators stood while a lament, the last post, and Lead Kindly Light were played. There was silence for a moment, then a cheer for the teams, and another for Faulkner as he ran towards the west goal. Then play began. Now, I can't help but contrast. That was it. That was all there was in the paper the next home game after his death. This is a week after his death. And I just contrast that with today's press, which would have seen an 8-page pull-out, live television coverage. But, of course, death was treated differently back then, even as big an event as this. And strangely enough, on that day, there was another article in the same Glasgow Herald, and it told of the worst mining accident, which has cast a gloom over the East Fife coalfield, took place at the Wellesley Colliery, Denbeath, when 2 men were killed. There was a surge of roof, a big section of roof fell, and the 2 men were killed. And they came from that area. Now, that's where Johnny Thomson came from. They signed him from the Wellesley Colliery. So he left that industry to get away from danger and went into danger, but it was an everyday occurrence in industry at that time. So, you know, there wasn't the sensationalism that you'd perhaps get today. Those few words, to me, in that article, said as much, and there was a photo of the teams coming out with the black armbands. It said as much as all the hype you would get today with the 8-page pull-out.
Absolutely. Very, very powerful, wasn't it, Tom?
Yeah.
And the incident itself, when you look back on the history of the club, and we all know the story that John Thomson was coming out and dived at the feet of Sam English and stuff, and there's been books and there's been films and everything done about it. But when you go back and you actually read the aftermath of it, and when you do these podcasts and you listen to these podcasts and you hear about this young guy, you know, coming from from Fife up to Glasgow, and you hear the stories about how good he was as a goalkeeper. It's only then that you start to think what a sad loss it was at the time.
Yes. I think I've tried to analyse it, and I suppose there's a few reasons. The fact his youth, the fact he was a clean-living young man, he was a Christian man, and just his sheer brilliance, that explains a lot of it. But it doesn't answer all of I'm puzzled about it still a bit, because the fans' favourite at that time wasn't so much John Thomson, McGrory, although they were favourites, but the big favourite was Bertie Thompson. Mm-hmm. And when Bertie Thompson died, tragically, a few years later, he'd also been on the tour with John, of course, John Thomson had 5,000 at his funeral, Bertie Thompson had 10,000. Mm-hmm. But he never captured the imagination of the press in the way that John did, because, well, Bertie was known to like a drink, and right. he wasn't the sort of exemplary role model, the ambassador that John Thomson was.
But still, Tom, Bertie Thompson was only 30 years old when he died in 1938.
Yes. And
we also lost Peter Scarff in this decade too.
This American tour, and I got very close to the players, and obviously when you're reading a lot about them and writing up these reports and reading all the newspaper articles, you have your favourites, and my favourites were the bad boys. They were Bertie Thompson, they were McGonigal, Scarff, maybe Willie Cook and Charlie Napier. I read the articles about Jimmy McStay and Jimmy McGrory going to visit shrines, and these people were good people, great ambassadors for the club, but they weren't interesting, if you like. I like the boys who were in the punch-ups, and those four that I've mentioned, they were the people who were always in controversy. And Charlie Napier, he got involved in controversy with a dancing competition that he'd won in Canada, and he won a watch. So he was a flamboyant character, and the press wrote an article about him giving a beggar woman money, and she said it was for medicine for her sick husband. And Charlie and the journalist who was writing the article had been in a pool hall when the woman had asked him, and they followed her home to see if she was telling the truth, I suppose. She stopped at a drugstore, bought medicine, and she stopped at a fruit shop, and they followed her to her house and knocked on the door, and sure enough, she was telling the truth, and her husband was in bed and he was ill. And in those days, if you were ill, you went by the board in that. It was a hard time if you didn't have money for the doctor's bills. So they then dug deep and give the woman some money. So nice stories like that you got. So you formed a liking with people, and as I say, Charlie won a watch for dancing and stuff like this. And Peter Scarff, when he was playing against Carsteel, I think it was, he hadn't brought his strip, so he asked the guy in the crowd for a loan of a green dress shirt, and played in that game and scored 5 goals wearing the dress shirt. So these were characters, and Bertie Thompson, well, the stories about him are legion. He had his tap stopped on the way home, and he was a sort of tragic figure. He had a lot of human failings, apparently, and that's one of the reasons he died so young, I think. But they were great characters, and you got a feel for them when you're reading all these articles. So it was very enjoyable for me to do this, because when I started this decade on the wiki, I looked at it and I thought it was a bit drab and boring. But as you did these match reports, and particularly in the United States, where the journalists were a bit more colourful and give you a bit more detail about them, then it put sort of flesh on the bones of the character. And there's a great photo of Bertie Thompson, McGonigal and Peter Scarff on the journey over, I think, on the ship, and you could virtually smell the drink off the photo, Chris. Bertie's in the middle, and he's got a bonnet on, and he's got a big cigar clamped between his teeth, and McGonigal one side and Napier the other. They've got straw boaters on, and they've got the look on their face like they're men who have had one or two, and they seem to be holding Bertie up in the middle. He's got a grip of both of them, and you can see the character oozing out of them, and then subsequent events, when you read about McGonigal smashing the ball down on McPhail's head at Ibrox, and then walking off the park. You can understand it because you've sort of seen the character of the guys from the photos and from the articles building up the picture of them.
It's absolutely magnificent. See all these stories. This is what makes the legend.
Absolutely, and the words that are associated with footballers, and it was Joe on the Celtic Wiki made comment about this as well, that you always seem to read the same words associated with players. You've mentioned Lithe with Johnny Thomson, you know, and Quiet with Johnny Thomson as well, but Peter Wilson, Quiet, Chick Geetons, you know, decent, honest, hard-working on the field. McGrory and McStay, devout men. And then, by contrast, you get the lively comments about some of the boys who were, you know, they were more red-blooded young men, shall we say. And as you piece the story together, you see where it comes from. And it's not for nothing that the people who were sent off in America were Scarff, Bertie Thompson, etc. It wouldn't be Alec Thompson, because Alec Thompson was a quiet, sincere, genuine, quiet man who went about his work quietly. And so the descriptions you've got, the adjectives that describe these guys, once you get the bigger picture and look at all the photos, they make sense.
But that's brilliant, Tom, so it is, because even you think about the teams you watch today, you're still looking for, you know, the Cavaliers in there as well, you know. And probably one of the things that sets Celtic apart from a lot of teams is that they had characters. No matter if their team on the pitch was rubbish, there was still the Charlie Tully there.
Yes.
You know, and these guys were absolutely worth the admittance fee on its own.
We seek him here, we seek him there, never to find is very rare. You can go to any single country in the world and you'll find dedicated followers.
A time when I've been behind enemy lines, one of them was at Tannadice. It was the time that the old very steep terracing and the shed behind the goals, and we had the other side, the uncovered side, and the other side of the steep terracing. So I went in there a bit behind the goals, and where the main stand is now, that corner down behind the goals at the shed had a load of Celtic fans in, but I'd been in the turnstile at the other corner. So I tried to make my way through the Dundee United fans in that shed behind the goals, and as I was edging my way through, some big guy with a Dundee accent stepped in front of me and says, "Where do you think you're going?" So I replied, "Just over to see my dad." And then he said, "So where do you live?" I says, "Dundee." He says, "What street?" So the only street I knew in Dundee was where our Willie and the Bruins came from, so I said Glebe Street. Then I get the big punch in the side of the face and started rolling down the terrace, and a couple of them centred up me. That was interesting. But I eventually made it over to the corner of the Celtic fans after much jostling and swinging of punches and stuff, but that was interesting.
Glasgow town is where he's bound to watch the famous hoops, 'cause he's a dedicated follower of Celtic.
I went behind enemy lines at Tannadice when we won the league, when Jan Vennegoor of Hesselink scored. I think I obtained the ticket from a pub in Dundee proprietor. It was the boy from the Lockheed Club, I think, bought them. However, entering the stadium was a bit difficult when the Endy without colours was approached by a steward or a police and asked, obviously, a trick question to find out if you're a genuine home supporter, like who was a goalkeeper of Dundee United, or what street do you stay in, what's your postcode. I managed to avoid them by the imaginary telephone conversation. I just put the mobile phone to my ear and made my way straight to the turnstiles. During the game, we were sat 2 rows through the front. One or two of the Dundee United supporters ran about us, were out, and any Celtic supporters who reacted to any missed chances or the news coming in via radios from the game at Pittodrie and when Aberdeen scored. against Rangers that night, and folk reacted, 1 or 2 get put out. However, it was a different story at the full-time whistle when the home support left the stadium, and there seemed to be several hundred had made their way into the away ends, and the great celebrations that night.
Yeah, you'll find dedicated followers of Celtic.
Well, the first game I went to see was in 1956, and our headmaster at the school I was at, St Margaret School, William Collins was his name. He took us to see Celtic, and up to that point I'd been an Aberdeen supporter because my friend was an Aberdeen fan. But we got marched along to the East End Park one Wednesday afternoon to see Celtic play Dunfermline, and my memory of that is I didn't go to see Celtic play. I went to see Charlie Tully's Celtic play.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, as a young guy, and my memories of the game, I can remember a guy with red hair would have been Bobby Evans, but the person I was looking for was Charlie Tully taking a corner, because it was legend.
That's right.
You wanted Charlie to put it in direct from a corner. So yeah, legend is right. And Willie Cook, the other guy I mentioned there, who went on to play for Everton, a great career with him. I read about him in the course of this thing, and in the Everton site, they said that his party piece was to put a half crown on his foot and kick it as high up into the air as he could and get it to land in his top pocket. It's style, isn't it?
That's right. That's brilliant. I love those stories. I could listen to those all night long, Tom.
Yeah.
But even the controversy on the field was also reflected with a lot of controversy off the field too in the 30s, because this was a decade where there was a lot of crowd trouble and trouble with the fans going to and from the games.
Yes, indeed. Well, I think you've got to remember that this was a very troubled time in the world, and you know, you had pogroms against Jews and gypsies in Europe at the time. You had Japan invading China. You had the Ku Klux Klan were rampant in the States, and in Scotland there was a serious move by the establishment via the Church of Scotland to send the Irish immigrants back to Ireland. So given that the government and the church were wanting to send us back, yes, there was an atmosphere of resentment against the Irish, and Irish Catholics in particular, who had came here for work. So against that background, yes, there was bound to be a lot of trouble.
And
but at least they were wanting to lynch us, so it wasn't as bad as a Ku Klux Klan. They just wanted to send us back to Ireland, so I suppose we should count our blessings.
And that was never more obvious than in 1933-34, whenever we played St Mirren.
Yeah, this was the incident at Brigton Station, when fans were travelling on a special train to go to the Celtic game at Love Street, and they were ambushed by the Billy Boys, by Billy Fullerton's gang at Brigton Tube Station. And the initial newspaper said there was a gang of 50, but at the subsequent trial, I think they put the figures up as high as about 200, had waited. It was a premeditated, planned thing. They'd waited at Brigton Station, and when the special train carrying the Celtic fans to the cup tie at St Mirren at Love Street had stopped to take on passengers, they just indiscriminately attacked anyone that was there, and they were using axes, bayonet, knife, and there was a court case, and some of them were jailed, but of course most of them would get away with it. But that was significant of the times. It wasn't typical, I would say, but it wasn't out of place at the times, and didn't get front page treatment at the times. You know, it wasn't a huge story, but it went on to a big trial, and some of them getting hard labour, the Billy Boys, of course. But yeah, that was of the times.
And the other thing about that decade was the early part of the decade, the first 5 years, if we're going to talk about what was going on back on the pitch, was far from impressive, and this was really the start of the demise of the success of the club. Well, obviously there was a few exceptions along the way, but the team on the pitch throughout the 30s and into the 40s and the 50s, Celtic just wasn't the team that it was in the early part of the century?
No. The period I did in the decade of the 30s had won 2 leagues, 3 Scottish Cups, and the Empire Exhibition Trophy, which was a one-off certainly, but excluding Glasgow Cups, that was a poor haul. And I look at the old firm game, the nerdy game, as a sort of, gauge for success. And in that decade, Celtic only won the nerdy game once. So, the Celtic fans would have been in bad heart, I think, generally through that decade. Although, as you say, 1 or 2 great examples, the 2 Scottish Cups, the one in the early part, were really, if you read the reports, attributed to the Bertie Thompson. One was a replay, the first one. And then, of course, later on they won it again in the Aberdeen final. But it wasn't a successful period.
And even to the point where the club brought back Jimmy McManamy as a coach to try and improve the team on the pitch. And this was met with a huge hallelujah. But even the likes of Napoleon coming back didn't have the effect that they were hoping for.
Well, I think the problems weren't of coaching alone. I don't think, regardless of how good Jimmy McManamy was and how good he was at geeing people up and getting them to play, Celtic were selling. The Biscuit Tin mentality was on the go at that time. They were a selling club, and when you look at the players they got rid of, they could have possibly been not a good team at that time. They could have been a great team, but as soon as anybody had a value, they were off. They were sold on, and I think that had something to do with it as well.
We're obviously talking about some of the stars at the time, and one of the things that we talked about just before we came on to record was the big names that were starting to shine in Glasgow, but were sold on to England for not fortunes.
No. But I think it's also worth mentioning as well, Chris, that it could have been a whole lot worse, because in 1927, Willie Mealy had twice tried to sell Jimmy McGrory to Arsenal, and it was only the fact that McGrory loved Celtic so much that we hadn't lost him already before we even got into the 30s. But into the 30s, people like Charlie Napier, Willie Buchan, Willie Fagan, Willie Cook, the O'Donnell brothers, Frank and Hugh, and of course Bertie, they were all sold to English clubs. And when I did my entries in the wiki, I always tried to include some trivia, and that included wee snippets from England. So when I did the Celtic reports for the games in the 30s, I also looked at what the newspapers were saying about what was happening in England. And it was amazing how often it was ex-Celtic players who were making the headlines. I mean, these players that I've mentioned, they didn't go, well, the exception of Bertie maybe, who came back to Scottish football quickly, but the others, they didn't go down there and play bit parts. They went down there and starred. You know, all of those that I've mentioned, Napier, Buchan, Willie Fagan, Willie Cook, Frank and Hugh O'Donnell, all played in FA Cup finals. Some got winners' medals in cup finals. And they were in the top scorers. They were in the press all the time. I was seeing their names coming up all the time. And it brought it home to me that if they had stayed, just how valuable they could have been. But, of course, it's easy for us to judge from a distance. And was it Willie Mealy or was it the board? You don't know the factors. But one thing for sure, they did get rid of a lot of good players, and eventually into the next decade, of course, Delaney. I think that the Biscuit mentality was well and truly to the fore at that time.
Good evening, London. Welcome to 7 o'clock news. On the 1st of September, 1939, I'm Wilfred Bumblescotch. Breaking news broadcast. Europe meets a fork in the road, as Chamberlain's appeasement is broken by Hitler's iron will of malice. The House of Commons is truly stirred by Germany's forceful invasion of Poland. Unless Hitler accepts a peaceful resolution, Britain could go to war.
From 1930 to 1940, the Celtic home shirt would change very little. Our green and white hoops were worn throughout this decade, along with the ever-present white shorts. The only slight changes to the home kit were subtle differences added to the socks. In 1930 to 1932, we wore black socks with a white hoop at the top, which was filled with small green diamonds. In late 1932, we wore black socks with 2 green hoops and a white hoop sandwiched in between the green hoops. From 1933 to 1936, green and white hoop socks were worn for the first time with the home kit. The white hoops were situated just below the knee, across the middle of the shin, and around the ankle. In 1936 to 1940, we seen a slight change to the home shirt with a white collar added along with a new style of socks. We still used the green and white hoop socks, but we dropped the middle hoop, leaving just the 2 white hoops in the socks, one below the knee and one just across the ankle. From 1930 to 1933, our away kit was a green shirt with no collar. This was worn with white shorts and black socks, with the 2 green hoops and the white hoops sandwiched in between the green hoops. In 1934 to 1935, we seen the green away shirt changed to include a white collar, which was worn with white shorts. During this time, we wore the same green and white hoop socks as the home kit. In 1935 to 1940, the only change to the away kit from the previous season was to swap the white shorts for black shorts.
We're here today to sit and watch the champions play.
The surprising part about all that, though, Tom, is that the crowds were still quite healthy in the 30s. It wasn't until the 50s where we really saw a decline in the numbers.
Yes, but I think the crowds for league games weren't always that good, and I think the crowds, they weren't kidded on by this. They knew what was going on and sometimes stayed away. And I think an example of that is when Willie Buchan went away. And Willie Buchan came back just the start of the war, and he played in a friendly against Hearts, and a game that would have at that time pulled 2,000. They reckon it drew 5,000, and that was attributable solely to Celtic fans wanting to see Willie Buchan in the Celtic jersey again. Mm-hmm. He was guesting for Celtic. So, yeah, I don't know. You would need to do a proper analysis on that, but I don't think the fans were kidded on by it. They weren't happy.
Well, I'm probably going on cup final numbers and stuff like that. The glamour games.
That's a different thing. Yeah, that's a different story. But league games, well, for instance, in 35-36, when Celtic won the title, they won it in front of a crowd of 10,000 at Celtic Park.
Wow.
And
bear in mind, that was the first title that they'd won in 10 years.
That's right. And McGrory wasn't playing, and that would have accounted for some of it. McGrory was injured. But at the next game, which was a nothing game, there was only one game to go in the season, which was at Firhill, there was a crowd of 20,000 hoping to see McGrory beat the record of the Motherwell player who held it at the time. So the crowds would come, but they were particular. And of course, in the 30s, there wouldn't be the money. They would have to be selective. But they could have attracted more if the personalities had stayed there, I'm sure. As I say, the term fans' favourite is always allocated to Bertie. Mm-hmm. Bertie Thompson, Robert Austin Thompson. He's the man who the fans loved. And of course, he couldn't get on with Melee, and they shipped him out in 33, and that wouldn't be popular. When 10,000 turn up for your funeral, you're a popular man. Mm-hmm. and that's what Bertie got. And that was years after he'd finished playing for Celtic. But he was on his tombstone as Bertie of the Celtic.
One little story during the 30s that's very good. We've spoken a lot up till now in the previous chapters about history repeating itself. And in case you didn't know this, and it's probably not a very well-known fact, in 1936, our goalkeeper was James Foley.
Yes.
And he played in a reserve game at Tynecastle.
I know all about it, Chris. He fascinated me, this James Foley. And when I put this on the Celtic Wiki, I couldn't believe it when I saw it. This is history repeating itself. This is a red-headed, Irish, Celtic-playing Catholic being assaulted at Tynecastle by a fan, by several fans.
1936.
Yeah. And for his trouble, for being assaulted, he is fined with an alternative 20 days in prison. And at least Neil Lennon didn't get charged.
Not yet.
So there's progress of sorts in Edinburgh with the judiciary, but it does make the mind boggle, and the circumstances were terrible. Foley had been getting called, and this is from the newspapers, of course, a Sinn Féin so-and-so, an Irish so-and-so, a Fenian so-and-so, and he'd apparently kicked the ball. He said he kicked it to the wall to rebound off, but apparently it went into the crowd. There's no dispute that it had never hurt or injured anybody, but that caused about 5 people to come on the park and assault Foley. And it was Foley that was charged. The fans ran off again, and Foley was charged, and he went to Plymouth Argyle in the meantime, but he was brought back to court, and whoever hired the King's Council, it was at that time, they hired the top man, a guy called Duffus, and it went on and for quite a bit, but nevertheless the sheriff, it wasn't a jury trial. Maybe that's the thing that's different from Neil Lennon. It wasn't a jury trial. The sheriff fined him and gave him an alternative of 20 days imprisonment. If it had been a jury trial, they might have hung him, you know.
I just thought that was a brilliant story that we need to bring out there. It was fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So moving on then throughout the decade, because we've still got the Empire Exhibition Cup to talk about. 1937 and the Scottish Cup final where Celtic beat Aberdeen 2-1 is very significant as well in not only the history of Celtic, not only the history of Scottish football, but in the history of world football.
Yep. Record crowd, 147,365 is the official attendance that it was given. Fantastic when you think, and far too many to be in Hampden, that's for sure. I've been in Hampden to see when Celtic played Leeds in the semi-final of the European Cup, and it's the most frightening experience I've ever had. I was a smoker at that time, and I certainly never had a cigarette. My arms were down my side. I couldn't move the whole game. So what it would have been like to have had 147,000 in, God alone knows. But, they got away with it. But, a terrific game.
And the final that day was probably won by Willie Buchan, who played for Celtic at the time, and he was another one of these stars that was sold like 3 months later to Blackpool for £10,000.
Yes, indeed, it was Buchan. It was known as Buchan's final. He got the newspaper reporter's man of the match, and as soon as it was over, more or less, and a price was on his head, they sold him. And Chick Geetons, he was another one who also got great billing there at that time. Geetons and particularly Buchan were the men of the match, and it was 2-1, and a great game apparently. Of course, Buchan got the winner. Johnny Crum scored at the first in 11 minutes, and then Armstrong equalised a minute later for Aberdeen, and going towards the end, Willie Buchan got it.
But could you imagine being at Hampden Park with 147,000 people?
Can't. As I say, Chris, I think they put the crowd at the Leeds United game at something like 130, didn't they? Mm-hmm. And I couldn't see you getting another cigarette paper in that ground.
But it just shows you how this football explosion had happened, in between the two wars. Even though there was huge poverty at the time and austerity at the time, for 147,000 people to turn up in 1937. Remember, we're only a year or so away from the war, the Second World War starting here, and everything that was going on, not only in Glasgow and Scotland and Britain, but in the world at the time. People still paid money to go and watch the football.
Well, and perhaps it was because of the sound of the war drums beating in events elsewhere in Europe, that people did want that diversion, a bit of escapism maybe to get away from these things. And of course, the conditions in Scotland were very poor as well, and wages were low, unemployment was high, and in fact they were reducing people's wages rather than giving them increases. So these were hard times. These were, very hard times, and maybe people just wanted to sacrifice that extra bit and get to that game for a wee bit of escape from it all.
Bigots from the SFA were plain to be seen. They tried to take away our flag of orange, white and green. The banners this Sir Robert says in answer to our call. He said Celtic first and Celtic last and Celtic over all.
Hope of more sustained success was short-lived, as an inconsistent Celtic suffered 2 barren seasons. But a couple of new arrivals should help change the immediate fortune of the team. In October 1934, Hoops legend Jimmy McMenemy returned to Parkhead as trainer. His arrival was followed in 1935 by that of English-born centre-half Willie Lyon, signed from Queen's Park. The relaxed and mild Madam McMenemy provided a welcome contrast to the discipline of Maley. Possessing an astute tactical mind, the new trainer would prove to be the perfect man to bring up the best from Parkhead's talented youngsters. On the pitch, Lyon added a stillness to the Hoops' defence. Under the increasing influence of McMenemy, and with a platform of an assured rearguard, the Celtic attack blossomed. In season 1935-36, the experienced McGrory hit an incredible 50 goals as Celtic romped to their first league title in a decade. The next campaign, Celtic would claim the Scottish Cup, and Willie Buchan and Johnny Crum inspired the Hoops to a 2-1 victory over Aberdeen, before an incredible record crowd of 146,433. The magnificent McGrory would retire at the end of the season, but with men like Crum, Buchan and Jimmy Delaney, there was hope the Celtic revival could continue into the club's Golden Jubilee year. This time, the hope was not misplaced. A wonderfully entertaining Celtic claimed the league flag of 1938 in emphatic style, but that fine triumph would not be the highlight of this landmark year. That summer would see Glasgow's Bellahouston Park play host to the Empire exhibition. Costing £10 million to stage, the exhibition was intended as a spectacular showcase of the British Empire. It would also be used by Glasgow in a bid to attract new investors into a city hit hard by economic troubles. A magnificent 300-foot Art Deco tower was built on top of Bellahouston Hill. An impressive model of the exhibition tower, also known as Tate's Tower after its architect Thomas Tate, would be offered as a prize in a major football tournament to commemorate the event. The Empire Exhibition Trophy was effectively a British championship, with the top clubs on both sides of the border invited to compete. All games would be played at Ibrox Park due to its proximity to the exhibition site at Bellahouston. Celtic would line up with Rangers, Aberdeen, Hearts, Brentford, Everton, Chelsea and Sunderland. The boys would progress to the final with fine wins over Sunderland and Hearts. Only Everton now stood between the boys and the trophy, the Goodison Park club having easily dismissed Rangers in their opening clash before edging out Aberdeen in a 3-2 thriller. So it was, on June the 20th, a crowd of 82,000 packed into Ibrox, Celtic and Everton battled it out for the unofficial title of British champions. They were to witness an enthralling and tense 90 minutes. The game swung from end to end, providing much more entertainment than the 0-0 scoreline would suggest. Everton were a team packed with internationals and would go on to win England's championship, but they had met their match in a great Celtic side. Extra time would decide the victor, and with Celtic taking a firm control of the game, Johnny Crum hit home the only goal of the match to claim the glory for the boys. Crum danced the jig of joy behind the net, and at full time, the Celtic support celebrated a wonderful triumph with rousing choruses of patriotic Irish ballads. But before long, the songs would be silenced. The Empire Exhibition Trophy would be Celtic's last major honour of the decade, and in September 1939, the Scottish League and Cup would be suspended as the world once more was plunged into war. Tate's wonderful exhibition tower would be demolished amid fears it would act as a landmark for Nazi bombers. But for Celtic fans, the memories of great players would remain firmly intact. Rangers may have retained their status at the top of Scottish football during the 1930s, but supporters of the Hoops were not short of heroes either. Heroes like Johnny Crum, a delightful centre forward who possessed swift feet and a quicker football brain. Men like the ever-dependable George Patterson and Bobby Hogg. There was the noble Jimmy Delaney, an exciting old-fashioned winger. Jimmy was not only blessed with pace and skill, but was as brave and hard-working as anyone who ever stepped onto a football field. The young Delaney was a naturally shy character, but Jimmy McMenemy instilled in the player a just belief in his own talent. With a dashing ring and scintillating form, Celtic were a match for any team. With a cool head, wonderful control and fantastic vision, Malcolm McDonald possessed an all-round game that was virtually unrivalled by his peers. Quick and clever winger Frank Murphy was a superb cross for the ball, and the Celtic attack thrived in his excellent deliveries from the left flank. Coupling skill with a fierce battling quality, Bertie Thompson played the game in a style guaranteed to win the approval of the Hoops support. Dazzling footwork made Charlie Napier a Celtic favourite, while the great Willie Lyon was widely regarded as one of the finest captains in the history of Celtic. A strong and tough tackling centre-half, Lyon was an uncompromising defender who possessed a rare coolness under pressure. A brilliant inside forward, Willie Buchan had great vision, drive and an ability to score vital goals. Canadian-born Joe Kennaway had the thankless task of being the long-term replacement for Johnny Thomson. You cannot replace the irreplaceable, but a fine keeper, Joe too would win a place in Celtic hearts. As war raged and an uncertain new decade loomed, football's importance was rightly diminished to an irrelevance. But with thousands of young men heading off to the battlefield each week, Celtic fans could be forgiven for remembering back to the poignant message carried on a memorial card handed out by Willie Maley following the death of Johnny Thomson. It read simply, "They never die who live in the hearts they leave behind."
So here we were, 1937, we're Scottish Cup winners, and then the next false dawn starts the year after, and in 1938 we of course won the Exhibition Cup.
Yes, a great occasion that, but yeah, and I think we were fortunate when I look at this, and if you go back a season, it was the practice then, it was an unofficial sort of tournament between the league winners in England and the league winners in Scotland, played each other on a two-leg basis. And the year before, of course, Celtic had been the champions and Sunderland were champions in England, so they met home and away, and Celtic won both of those games. But interestingly enough, in the first leg at Celtic Park, it was interesting in that both goalkeepers were keepers who had been signed to replace goalkeepers who had been killed on the pitch. Kennaway was the Sunderland one, and I think a guy called Mapson was the Sunderland one. He'd replaced a guy called Jimmy Thorpe, who had played against Chelsea at Roker Park, and with the rules in those days where you could kick the ball from the keeper's hands and pretty much do anything to a goalkeeper, he'd received terrible treatment the whole game, and he didn't die that day, but he was taken to hospital and died some weeks later. And in fact, in 2011 when Chelsea played Sunderland, both keepers had black armbands on.
Oh,
but
well.
it stood Celtic in good stead because they met Sunderland on the way to the final against Everton, and obviously they had the measure of Sunderland, having played them twice recently. And it went to 2 games again, I think, with Sunderland in that competition.
And tell me this, Tom, the Exhibition Cup was by invite only, wasn't it?
Yes. Yes, it was the top teams in England and Scotland. And there was Hearts and Celtic and Hibs and Rangers and Everton, Sunderland, and it was one of those unfashionable teams in England, wasn't it? The one that Jerry McAloon played for, Brentford.
Right.
And not one of the big names that you would associate with the top ones, but at that time it was. So yeah, it was by invitation, and they had all the top teams. I don't think anybody would want Celtic to win something that was a tournament for the Empire.
Much like the Coronation Cup and years later, and Victory in Europe Cup. He always won all these cups. The Empire
That's
Cup.
Right. So against the odds, and just to spite everybody, Celtic go and win it. And of course, one of my favourites was playing against them in the final, Willie Cook. He went to Everton, and he was a great success at Everton. In fact, I think he played over 200 games at Everton, and he went on to manage national sides. He managed Peru, he managed Iraq, he managed Norwich City. I think he managed quite a few sides. So he was no slouch, Willie Cook, but he was unlucky that day. He was on the wrong side in the final against his old teammates.
And the Empire Exhibition Cup again should have been a springboard for Celtic to go on. Of course, the war then interrupted a lot of that. However, even that team at that stage, instead of building on the team was starting to be dismantled after that final.
Yeah, it's the Celtic way, I suppose. It was a great team: Kennaway, Hogan, Morrison, Geaton's, Lyon and Patterson, Delaney and MacDonald, Crum, Divers and Murphy. And Jimmy Delaney wouldn't last too long. And it's sad that it always seems to be the way with Celtic.
And it goes back again to what you were saying earlier on. The following year, you just knew there was something in the air, because come the New Year's Day game, the usual happened.
Yeah.
Lost at Ibrox.
Yep. They get beat by 2-1 by Rangers before a crowd of 120,000, or near as damn it. And there are 30,000 locked out. But we were nowhere near Rangers in the league that year. We finished second to them, and we were adrift by 11 points. We were dumped out of the Scottish Cup by Motherwell, so getting up towards 1940, we ain't looking good.
We seek him here, we seek him there, never to find is very rare. You can go to any single country in the world and you'll find dedicated followers of Celtic.
My main one was Tynecastle. Me and my good mate Eddie Hoy, we went up there on the Saturday and the game get postponed. Or were we there? I don't think we were actually there on the Saturday, but the game get postponed on the Saturday. So we went up in the car early on a Wednesday night, and we still get the Gorgie Road end side at the time, and we get a small bit of the main stand. So we were walking up, and there's this wee guy there, and he said he'd spare tickets, but they were for the main stand, the Hearts party. So he said 15 quid, so we've looked at it, it says 15 on it, so we gave the guy 15 quid. What we didn't realise, it said 3 o'clock on it. So what happened is these tickets had been issued for the first game. I don't know if they were reissued or whatever, but they must have got duplicates printed because it was a scam anyway. But what happened is me and Eddie went round to the main stand, so didn't have any colours on, paid in, gave the tickets to get in their main stand. So he was about 10 seats away from me and a couple of rows behind. So I'm sitting in my seat and the guys came and sat next to me. So the guys came and sat next to me with the heart scarf and the earphones, and we turned around and said to him, "Look mate, is there any chance you could swap tickets with my mate so that my mate can sit next to me?" And the boy, to be fair, is like that, "Aye, no bother." So he's took Eddie's ticket, So me and Eddie are in these two seats sitting together and a bit edgy. The Celtic fans are over a bit in another bit, but there's a few tasty looking Hearts fans coming planking their arses next to us. The next minute we've looked round and seen the guy who we swapped tickets with getting questioned by a steward. So next thing, he's looking round to see if he can see who swapped his ticket with him. So me and Eddie have clocked this straight away, and we've done a bolter up the back of the stand, and we've went right over to where the Celtic fans were and climbed over a wee wall into them. So it was well oversubscribed, this bit, but we told some guys in it, so they let us go over and we squeezed up. Next thing, the guy's getting led out with stewards, and he's pointing over to where we were sitting, and he's explaining, there's two guys, I swapped my seat. So the guy at the Hearts fan get through out, and me and Eddie were in the Hearts end, and I think we won, we scored about 4 that night, and we were right up the back of that main stand, and the place was absolutely rocking on a Wednesday night. I can't mind the year, but it was in the 90s, and it was during the Rotten Mob's 10 in a row, so it was one of the final seasons coming up to it for us to stop the 10, the Rotten Mob's 9 in a row, and it was for them to, I don't think it was a season for them to go to 10, but my memory's playing tricks, but it was definitely in the 90s, and it was a great experience, and that Hearts fan got launched out at expense. But there you go.
Yes, you'll find dedicated followers of Celtic. Yeah, you'll find dedicated followers of Celtic.
And that was the way the decade ended, in a little bit of depression for not only, the football team and the football club, but when you think the war was going on at the time, the decade ended in great travesty, didn't it?
Yes, it did. And on the 1st of January 1940, we drew 1-1 at Ibrox with the Rangers. And it was originally scheduled for Parkhead, that game, but the SFA, under wartime regulations which limited the crowd to 40,000, had decided that Ibrox was a safer venue. Nothing new there. Make us play at Ibrox. And on the day that match was reported in the press after the Nerdy game, Willie Maley announced his imminent retirement from football, and in the 1939-40 season, Celtic ended up 13th out of 16th.
That's right.
Out of 16 teams in the Western Regional Team League. Poor show. And I think it's pretty much well recognised that Celtic just sort of closed up shop for the war. They weren't interested, whereas other teams tried to keep their team together, and there was no shortage of famous players wanting to play, wartime postings to Scotland, who were good footballers in their own right in England or wherever, and who had in the past played for Celtic, such as the O'Donnell brothers, Buchan, guesting in Scotland, but they weren't guesting with Celtic. They were invariably going out to other teams. So it just seems that Celtic shut up shop and just gave up any hope of maintaining a team and coming out the other side of this thing strong. That's how it seems to me, and others as well, I would say. And the chap I was researching that started me off on the wiki was one such player, a guy called Hugh O'Neill. And I originally got into this wiki thing just out of interest in Hugh O'Neill, a man I knew, and had been a Celtic player between 39 and 40, and he had signed on in 30, and then I'll look at all these match reports. He only played about 16 games, and he never gets a bad report. In fact, the opposite, he gets good write-ups, and at the end of it all, he's just told he can go. Celtic weren't interested.
And that again is a story that comes out again and again and again, right up to even modern day. But, when you talk to some of the old players, including some of the Lions, a lot of players, and it seemed to be the Celtic way, left the club and left a little bit disgruntled.
Yes, yeah, that's sad. That's very sad. But yes, that is the case. That for all there are many wonderful things about our club, we're not perfect. There is this lack of interest in, I think, the ethos of the club. Something that's the way I see it. But I'm not making the books match. Perhaps they've got it right, and it's easy for us to criticise.
There you go. But Tom, let me ask you one more question before we sign off on Chapter 4. 1938 was the 50th anniversary of the club. Was there anything special done to celebrate 50 years of being in business?
Not that I'm aware of, and I've put match reports in. I've read every newspaper, every Scottish newspaper, well, Herald and Scotsman, for every game that's taken part in that era. And I've put the match reports online on the wiki for anyone to see. And the wiki's a great thing. I'll just plug that. And Joe Blogs and the guys who run it have put far more into it than I ever will. But it's a great, sort of a repository of all things Celtic. But I don't know of a 50th anniversary celebration of Celtic. And it may be this thing that they were formed in 87 but started playing in 88 that makes the date a bit vague. But I'm not aware of anything, Chris.
Well, Tom, to talk about the 30s, and you made a very relevant point at the beginning. When you started to think about the 30s, you thought, what the hell happened in the 30s? And like every decade so far, there was loads and loads of things that happened in the 30s, wasn't there?
There was loads of things happening in the 30s, and refereeing controversies were still there. And there's one incident that I thought was amusing, and it was, although the press, when I got a feel for the press, of course, looking at all these newspaper articles and putting them on the wiki and transcribing them often, and there was a game at Parkhead in 1940, in April 1940, and it was an Old Firm game, and a referee who would become infamous with Celtic, a guy called Matthew Dale, MC Dale, he gave, Celtic were winning 1-0, and he gave a penalty to Rangers when Alex Venters died with no one near him. And fair play to Rex of the Sunday Mail. He wrote that as an exposition of the histrionic arts, it was superb. And he went on, if there's such thing as a soft penalty, this one was seeping through the fingers. What is that? Well, you would never get that written these days.
That's brilliant, isn't it? You could wax lyrically back then, and it was very poetic.
Yes, indeed. It was all very Chumley Warner stuff, British party news,
The nicest way to call him a David so-and-so.
yeah, in a nice way. But it was so bad that even the very pro-Rangers press, as it was in the 30s, they just had to comment on this. They couldn't let it go.
Fantastic. Tom, that was absolutely brilliant. I thoroughly enjoyed that.
Well, I've enjoyed speaking to you, Chris.
Now, before you go, I'm going to ask you to nominate a charity that we will donate your portion of all the monies raised so far. And who would that be, Tom?
It would be the Belfast Celtic, Chris. Given the history that I've listened to with your two-part podcast on that, it would certainly be them. And I'd want to do something. I mentioned earlier that my interest in Celtic was originally aroused by our headmaster at St Margaret's, William Collins, taking the whole school to the game to see Celtic at East End Park. And I'd like to see if I can fix up something with Belfast Celtic and get a dozen lads over to a Celtic game, maybe 6 from each community. And
whenever you say 6 from each community, you mean 6 from West Belfast and 6 from North Belfast, don't you?
Well, is that? I'm not familiar with Belfast, but that's what I mean. Yeah.
Anybody from Belfast would probably be chuckling at that right now, because that's not what you meant.
I've never had the pleasure of visiting that city, Chris.
Well, Tom, what I will do is I will put you in contact with the Belfast Celtic Society guys, who I know very well, and I'll let you talk to them, and you can work all that out, and we will make a donation to you, and you can see what you can sort out.
I'll take it from there. That's great, Chris. That's great. And thanks for having me on the programme. I've enjoyed it. And, I'm grateful to the Wiki as well for giving me a free rein to let me put my 1930s stuff online so that people coming along in the future can have a wander through this era, and they can maybe share some of the experiences of the guys in New York and read about the bad bits as well, the people being attacked on the trains and the John Thomson thing. And it brings to life some of the sort of the legends about the club.
Absolutely. Hopefully we're going to be adding a little bit of colour to some of the black and white photographs that you've enjoyed up to now.
Okay, Chris.
Tom, that was absolutely marvellous, and I can't thank you, and I can't thank the Wiki enough, because without the Wiki, you know, we wouldn't know half of the stuff that goes on.
We would not indeed. It's a marvellous thing, and of all the football sites I've looked at, and I've looked at them, I don't just write about, I try to put a bit about opposition players and English players, and I've looked at all the websites, and the Wiki is pretty much as good as any, and better than 90% of them.
Tom Minogue, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Nice speaking to you, Chris.
Fantastic.
Cheers now.
There you are, folks. That's the end of chapter 4. Absolutely fantastic again. Tom was magic, so he was. See, just to sit and talk to Tom. A pure delight. A pure delight. So thanks very much to Tom Minogue and Joe Blog City from the CelticWiki.com for making chapter 4 possible. But also special thanks to the Human Torpedo, Chris from the Paradise Report, Stuart from the CelticShirt.co.uk, Pat from Half the World Away podcast, Jason Higgins from Homeboys, Kelly from Stonehouse, the Wakes, Charlie and the Boys and Alison for the music, the Parrot, and everybody that sent in their little sound bites. They are absolutely magic, so they are, and are able to break up the podcasts and keep your interest going. Our donations are starting to come along. After a wind last week, they're starting to pick up a little bit, but it's still not where we need to be. So if you've downloaded this, remember to go in to HailHailMedia.com and make a donation. Just find the donation button. It's on the blog that accompanies the Celtic History podcast, and it's dead easy to find. And scroll down the page and you'll find the donate button, where you need to pay by PayPal or any major credit card. 50p, £1, £5. Some people have sent us £20, and I really can't thank everybody enough that have already donated. You're really going to make a difference. So come on, do what's right and send us a few quid, and we'll donate all that money to charity at the end of the series. So let me give you that again, HailHailMedia.com. Go in there and find the Celtic History podcast and press the donate button. So next week we're going to cover 1940 to 1950. And again, it's one of those decades that people conveniently forget, but there was tons went on. Not only did we have the wartime when the leagues were suspended and Celtic had to play in a regional league, but also we had the Victory in Europe Cup, we had players going away to the war, we had things that affected Celtic and Glasgow society during that period, and it is absolutely compelling. I'll be joined by Marty Flynn from the Huddle Board and the Belfast Celtic Society to cover all that. And if you listen to Marty and I walking around West Belfast doing the Belfast Celtic podcast, you know Marty's a great colourful character, and no doubt we'll have loads and loads of anecdotes and things you hadn't heard before. I mean, this is the period whenever Willie Mealy finally stands down and is replaced by Jimmy McStay, and he in turn then lasts throughout the war, and then the legend that is Jimmy McGrory takes over as manager. And it all makes for brilliant listening, and of course we'll have all the regulars in there as well. We'll also have a wee special feature on the next podcast as well, and we're going to start doing that from the decades moving forward. We've loads and loads of stuff recorded already. We've got player interviews to load in there. We've got different fan organisations in for a wee chat as well to talk about the development of how the supporters changed throughout the decades. And again, all compelling listening. So once again, thanks to everybody for donating. You can go to HailHailMedia.com and donate a few quid, and let's raise some money for the charities. Remember also, if you want to send your audio bites and you want to appear on the Celtic History podcast, it's easy as pie. Record yourself on your iPhone, your smartphone, your computer, your voice recorder. Get the file and email it to lostboys@gmail.com. That's lostboys@gmail.com. And remember the decades that are coming up. We've still to do the 60s, we've still to do Lisbon, and we've still to do the 70s and Kenny Dalglish and the Quality Street Gang. We've got the 80s and the centenary year. We've got the 90s and where you were when the Rebels won. Then we've got Fergus and the takeover. Oh my goodness. Get your audio bites in now and we'll put them on there. And they really are the thing that sets a podcast off. It's a fans podcast, a fans history of Celtic. So join in, because if you don't, you're going to regret it. Okay, you've been listening to the Celtic History Podcast. My name's Chris McGuigan. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Playing us out are your confessions. Talk to you all next week.
I'm Martin Kelly, now living in Melbourne, originally from Glasgow, from Partick and from Govan Hill. 6-2 game in Glasgow. I was actually back in Glasgow. My mum was ill and I had a hell of a month. And for 2 hours during that month, I was in sheer ecstasy watching Celtic smash Rangers 6-2. Yeah, Charlie Nicholas. I lived in Maryhill. In fact, I lived in the same estate as Charlie Nicholas, though he was obviously quite a bit older than me. But when Charlie left, it broke my heart.
I am Chris McMonigal. I am currently living on the Gold Coast in Australia, which is about an hour south of Brisbane. I am basically originate from the south side of Glasgow. It was the first time I came to live in Australia. I remember watching Celtic game thinking, is this the last time I'm ever going to be at Celtic Park? And it happened again 2 years ago when I went back to Scotland, and I was at Celtic Inverness game, and again the same thoughts went through my head. You know, having been there all this time, is this going to be the last time I'll ever be at Celtic Park? So
I am Jim Kinlan. I'm originally from East Kilbride, but I left East Kilbride 1984, so I've been 30 years since I left. I now live in Sydney, Australia. I left Scotland in December 84. I never ever went back to Scotland to live. I came to Australia 20 years ago, but I left Scotland in December 84. My last big game I seen was in October 84, and it was the Rapid Vienna game. Well, we won 3-0, and then, there was a thing about them ball thrown in the pitch and all that rubbish. But I was there with a girl, and she was a Celtic supporter. She was at my school, and she was bloody hot to look at. And we went to the game together, and I remember when it was 2-0 up, she was a mad Celtic supporter, and when we went 2-0 up, and we were on the away goals at that time, and I was thinking, oh, please score. If we score here, and I wasn't thinking about the game, I was just thinking, if we score, I'm going to get my leg over. And that's probably the biggest confession I can make. I remember being at that big game and really no caring about the result, just as long as we got through, so I'd have my fun times afterwards.